The magic of childbirth, boys and girls. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Merry Christmas,
Motörhead, for me, are the most fantastic adrenaline rush in the world. And you have to have it. At least once a year, if not more. And without it, life just isn't the same.
Motörhead were the loudest band in rock and roll. You know, to some of us, they still are.
Motörhead, they just had real balls.
Lemmy came in with his catchphrase about, is it loud enough for you? The obvious answer was always no. Right, turn it up.
I think it's all about the power of the music. It's all about really just sort of vibrating people. Lemmy's bass sounded like a rusty chain. I mean, Phil was like an avalanche and Eddie was just a torrential wave of sheet metal noise. I mean, it was just glorious.
There's no question about it. Motörhead were unique.
You know, Motörhead were the original sort of tooth-rattling, bone-shaking rock band.
If Motörhead moved in next door to you, your lawn would die.
You're hearing basic, brutal, raw rock and roll, loud, in your face, the way it's meant to be.
And don't forget the Joker.
Motörhead's very first track was the song Motörhead, which of course was the Hawkwind number. And when Lemmy was booted out of Hawkwind by Dave Brock and company, he decided, I'm going to put together a band called Bastard.
After they got over not calling the new band Bastard, because they wouldn't get on top of the pops with that name, they called it Motörhead after a speed freak.
Let's face it, Lemmy liked speed, so much so I think there's the old apocryphal rock and roll story that his doctor told him that if he stopped taking it, he'd die because his system wouldn't been able to take the shock.
It was declaration of intent. Lemmy sticking his flag up high, you know, from the word go. And it was perfect for them. And it was only right, you know, when they signed to a label that would be their first single after White Line Fever, which was also a declaration of intent and of another sort.
Lemmy brought a lot to Hawkwind in terms of the earthy bass and a slightly more aggressive style. And when Lemmy was kicked out of Hawkwind because of drug problems in America, inevitably what Lemmy took into starting Motörhead had elements of what he'd learnt with Hawkwind. Not a huge amount, but Hawkwind weren't just a psychedelic band, they had a lot of rock and roll about them as well.
I think Lemmy probably bought the anarchy that he'd bought. I mean, anarchy probably existed in Hawkwind, given they were such a free-form sort of outfit. You know, they're sort of free-thinking, sort of new ideas, you know, that kind of whole anarchic way of expressing yourself. These kind of hippie collectives sort of had, like Hawkwind and Gong. You know, it's like, well, let's do something new. And I think Lemmy took that to the extreme, so much so, I think, that obviously that's why Hawkwind chose to sack him.
As he used to say, they used to like sitting in the vegetarian restaurant waving at him while he was sort of walking around grinding his teeth off his nut on speed.
Lemmy, I mean, you've been playing with a decent band, Hawkwind. I mean, Hawkwind was quite decent. Why did you do Motörhead in the first place?
Hawkwind wasn't decent. Hawkwind was just as heavy as Motörhead, but we didn't have the big PAs in those days, you see. We had to build up, you know, to this point here.
Psychedelic.
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 Yeah.
Motörhead's version of Motörhead was a little more frenetic than the Hawkwind version, which, given the rather laid-back nature of Hawkwind, it was kind of a bit more of a sort of a plodder. Whereas when Motörhead finally laid it down, it was a bit more white noise.
Now, it's not that different from the way Hawkwind did it. Slightly less psychedelic, slightly heavier and slightly dirtier, but not that far removed.
To this day, you can't go to a Motörhead show and not have them play Motörhead. You know, this is what you want from a Motörhead show. When you buy a ticket to see Motörhead, you must see them play Motörhead. It's the law. The first Motörhead album was an absolute classic. I remember Nick Kent in the NME reviewed it and called them the worst band in the world, which Lemmy has never forgiven him for, but in actual fact made you incredibly curious. I mean, if this is the worst band in the world, how cool must that be?
So it did them a little bit of a favour. Had they been a little too tight, a little too professional, I don't think they'd have picked up the audience that they did, which is a combination of fed-up hippies and fed-up Hawkwind fans and punks, because punks picked up on the energy and the vibe and the dirtiness and the aggression.
And punk may have stolen all the headlines because that was like Image, and Motörhead looked like a bunch of greasers, so they weren't anything new. But Motörhead were creating at the time the most sort of frightening and shocking new noise that there was to be heard.
If you'd never seen them, you'd definitely think it was a punk album. If you had seen them, you definitely would know this was not a punk album. I mean, Lemmy looked like the biker from hell. Fast Eddie, you know, even longer hair than Lemmy. Called Fast Eddie, didn't play very fast, just chords. And at the back, you know, you've got the drummer from the Muppets, you know, so incredibly interesting group, but hadn't a couple of great tracks, but as an album, clearly they'd made it in, probably spent all of 20 minutes on it, making it, and then straight out the door.
You know, there were a lot of awful punk bands. There was a lot of very pretentious fringe of punk bands, and Motörhead were the real thing. They weren't trendy, but they were not embraced by the weeklies. I was putting them in zigzag regularly as a kind of almost that famous finger of the rest of the music business. Because I did believe in them, I just thought there's nothing more exciting than this.
The audience Motörhead had in those days was incredible. I mean, of course, you got, you know, a lot of biker kind of dudes, a lot of acid heads, a lot of Hawkwind leftovers, a lot of punk kids that were looking for, that were Damned fans or Pistols fans, really enjoyed that kind of theatre of the absurd, which Motörhead also embodied.
I saw them one time. Lemmy struck a pose on a flight case, and the flight case went scooting, like the place was only like half full. And he went scooting across the middle of the dance floor, because it was a very small venue, on one leg, still trying to play bass. I mean, things would happen like this. They were just intent on putting, you know, the cat among the pigeons with the punks.
There was this just kind of a lull in the music scene just before punk came up. And it went through this incredible Bob Harris kind of sleepy kind of lull, where the best you had was Rory Gallagher and perhaps Lynyrd Skynyrd, but you had nobody who was going to blow your head off, which I loved with the Who and Cream and all that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, you know, after sort of 6 or 7 years of this lull, I go to the Art Centre to see Motörhead, and they blow my head off, and you have 90 minutes of absolutely sheer kind of pulse racing sort of adrenaline rush, which you haven't had for years. You think, shit, this is what I was missing. Yes, I got it back at last, you know, and of course immediately that is it. You've grabbed hold of it and you don't want to let go.
Overkill isn't as good as it gets from Motörhead, but my God, it was a step in the right direction.
Overkill was very much the first Motörhead album that I think the rest of the world first paid attention to. You've got this amazing title track, of course, Overkill, which talk about it does what it says on the tin. It really was and is the most tremendous track.
I mean, just listen to the speed of Phil Taylor's drumming on Overkill itself.
Overkill! Overkill! Overkill!
You know, I mean, that's frightening. I don't believe that any metal drummer came up with anything quite as bombastic until Dave Lombardo in Slayer. But before that, I mean, we're talking a long way before that. Listen to Filthy Taylor's drums on Overkill. That's fast stuff.
No messing around guitar solos, no messing around keeping a beat with the drums, just bing bang bish bash bosh wallop wallop wallop, and as fast as you can go, and no stopping till the end.
Overkill! Overkill! Overkill!
I spoke to Eddie Clark about it, funnily enough, and Phil Taylor wanted an excuse to have an extra kick drum or bass drum. He wanted two, like Ginger Baker, I guess, but he needed a reason to have two. So he bought another one and thought, well, it can be a spare for the tour, and the pedal can be the spare for the tour anyway. So I've not lost anything. So he integrated it into his kit. And Lemmy and Phil came into the rehearsals one morning when they were sort of getting the songs together for Overkill, and they heard this bada 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 bada, and they thought, fuck hell, what's going on? And went in, and Phil was playing this. And they said, don't stop, let's get the tape recorder and tape this a bit quick, you know. So they taped it. And of course, as the song develops, you know, Lemmy sort of starts off his bit on about the 12th fret and sort of sounds like a B-52 bomber sort of coming into land as it flows on down. And I said to Eddie about it, and he said, well, yeah, he said, Phil was absolutely going crackers on the kit, and Lemmy was going crackers on the bass. And he said, I thought, well, if I go crackers as well, it's going to be a bit silly. And if you kind of listen to Eddie's chords on there, they're pretty kind of laid back, and they're sort of ding, 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 ding. They're very... He chose them extremely well.
We used to do regular television shows. We used to hire you at television studio, and we used to do regular bronze get-togethers. So we would take 4 or 5 artists and effectively do a top of the pops. Very, very economical way of making video. And Keith McMillan had this idea of doing Motörhead, and I said, well, there's no way we're going to record Motörhead live. He said, well, fine, we'll make up a tape and they can mime to it. And we actually got them to do it. And what was interesting was halfway through, and it's 20 minutes long, so you can only run it so many times, and halfway through, Phil said, I can't do this. I cannot play 20 minutes non-stop to a tape. And I said, I don't care what you do, even if you drop dead, just keep going, because all the cameras will pick up whatever else is going. And we made a really good video.
The title track itself is absolutely monstrous. It's a tremendous tour de force of rock and roll. And I use the term rock and roll as opposed to metal or hard rock because that's the way Lemmy has always defined his band. He's always said, we're not metal, we're not punk, we're not hard rock, we're rock and roll. And that's exactly what you hear on the Overkill album.
I think Motörhead fans and Lemmy himself would concede that the 3 albums that led up to No Sleep Till Hammersmith were really the creative peak of the first Motörhead. Overkill was obviously the start of that. It was the first album they recorded with Jimmy Miller, who was very well known for his work with the Rolling Stones. Obviously, it was a big thrill for Lemmy to work with such an esteemed and legendary producer. And I think Jimmy Miller really pulled himself up by his bootstraps, came up with some really good sounds. And I think it was what he gave Motörhead in terms of sound that Lemmy was able to use later on in the band's career.
Obviously, the main problem with Motörhead is capturing that beast and getting it onto record and representing that enormous power that they had. And the first album, it was great, but it got through on its energy more than the quality of the sound. Overkill managed to catch it a bit more.
1,000 nights I spent alone, solitaire to the bone. But I don't mind them, my own best friend, from the beginning to the end.
Jimmy Miller took them, with his Stones experience, into a whole new area. Although that's what we know as Motörhead, and they probably always sounded like that, but it was a, if you like, it was a cleaner, dirty band than they had been before. They recorded in our studio downstairs, so I was in and out of the studio while they were recording with Jimmy Miller. And Lemmy came up to me and said, "This guy's absolutely fantastic." They were completely knocked out with Jimmy Miller.
Overkill's where it all really started to take off. People started to realise that this is when the metal hordes got into them, and Motörhead started to get their own little army. And by now we knew that snaggletooth visage was going to be Motörhead's kind of mascot, and that was played on, and it was all falling into place for Bomber.
Bomber was not really the album that Overkill was if we look at it coldly and dispassionately. It had some great tracks, Bomber itself, Stone Dead Forever, All the Aces. They're classic tracks. The highs were high but the lows were lower, not as consistent as its predecessor.
The way we fly, 5 miles off the ground. Because we shoot to kill, and you know we always will. It's a bomber, it's a bomber.
In terms of musicality, if anything, Bomber was a slightly disappointing album as compared to Overkill. Not that it was a bad record by any stretch of the imagination, it was very strong. However, Overkill was so good, it overshadowed Bomber to some extent.
Of course, the thing you've got to remember with Motörhead in those days, that the albums are very much the platform upon which they built the live show. The albums were done extremely fast, no messing about, none of this, we're going to spend 3 months in the country writing some songs and then 3 months rehearsing them and then another 6 months working with a top producer and seeing what good textures we can come up with. It was, what are you doing at 9 o'clock on a Friday night? Let's get in there and we'll be finished by Monday morning. We won't sleep, but we won't mess around either.
The other two albums had really failed to capture the live power, and Bomber failed even more to capture the live power. As ever, they were getting through entirely on the energy, the attitude and the quality of the songs. And if the quality of the songs isn't all there, which on Bomber, to be honest, they weren't, you can always tell by how many get played live after about one tour, and not many from Bomber survived. Probably the title track was the only one.
Scream 1,000 miles, hear the black death rising moan.
What was different with Bomber as compared to Overkill was the stage set. They brought in the Bomber for the title track, which people immediately picked up on and think, wow, what a great trick. This is fantastic. A bit of stage presence, amazing.
Lemmy has a fascination with World War II aircraft, World War II insignia. When I used to visit him at his house, the whole house would be covered in these models that he'd spend hours and hours and hours building and painting. So Bomber came from that, and live, Bomber would be the last number of the night, and the lighting rig was fashioned like the wings of a Spitfire. I think in Lemmy's mind it was a Messerschmitt.
And it was quite something to see, you know, with the band underneath and the wings going and the nose going down and all that, you know, and it weighs a fair old bit, you know, and they must have a lot of faith in that thing hanging over their heads when they're just sort of playing away and not taking any notice of what's going on.
It was great until Lemmy stuck his leg on it one night and the thing went back up again, took Lemmy with it, and he was stuck. I mean, that's another good example of things going wrong.
It sounds so crude, and it was, but in those days it looked as if the plane was coming in to crash land, and in the middle of it was Lemmy just absolutely singing his heart out, Bomber! And it was just the most tremendous end to the most tremendous night.
Because, you know we do it right. I make sure every night. It's a bomber, it's a bomber, it's a bomber.
Despite the fact that musically, Overkill is probably slightly the better album, Bomber was slightly the more commercially successful record. Again, simply because of the momentum of the time and the market forces and so forth. But there's no question, Bomber is still a very good album. However, I don't think personally it's good as what came before, Overkill, or what was to come afterwards, Ace of Spades.
If you like to gamble, I'll tell you how you land. You win some, lose some, it's all the same to me.
Ace of Spades is it.
Commercially, Ace of Spades was the one. It took them over the top and finally made them into a band that everybody knew.
Ain't no difference what you say. I don't say agree. The only card I need is the Ace of Spades. The Ace of Spades.
Ace of Spades has got to be in the top 10 greatest rock albums ever missed, whoever compiles it ever. Not just because it was a great album, but because it was such an influential album. And of course the icing on the cake was the title track, Ace of Spades.
Snake eyes watching you.
Is it punk? Is it metal? It's Motörhead. That's what it is, and it's Motörhead at their absolute zenith.
You know I'm going to lose, and gambling's for fools. But that's the way I like it, baby. I don't want to live forever. And don't forget the Joker.
Well, I absolutely love Eddie's playing on Ace of Spades. I think he's a great guitarist, and his licks in Ace of Spades that's what Motörhead is about to me. And there's a wonderful combination of the way Lemmy sings Ace of Spades and Eddie puts those licks in. It's the epitome. To me, that's their best track.
Ace of Spades was one of those records that some bands have, and they have a moment, and that's their moment.
It's kind of like the Who's My Generation. You know, Hope I Die Before I Get Old. It was, I Don't Want to Live Forever. And although the lyrics, you know, Lemmy says, well, don't read anything into them. They're just about playing cards, you know, and about the dead man's hand and all that type of thing. It's the I Don't Want to Live Forever, which, I mean, the words are, don't forget the Joker, but over the last few years, Lemmy has said, but it looks like I'm going to, instead of don't forget the Joker, because he just goes on and on and on, bless him.
I did try and take Lemmy to task about the lyrics once, and I said, isn't that a bit like when Pete Townsend wrote the line, hope I die before I get old? And he said, absolutely not. He said, because Townsend had actually screwed up, because hope I die before I get old means you're going to die soon. Whereas Lemmy saying, I don't want to live forever, actually meant, you know, he could die the day before forever. In other words, he could live to be thousands of years old, drink millions of bottles of bourbon, take zillions of drugs, and make love to billions of gorgeous, scantily clad, tattooed ladies. So I don't want to live forever was his way, as he explained it to me, of actually saying, I want it all, and I want it for as long as I can get it.
Pushing up the ante, I know you got to see me. Read on and weep, the dead man's hand again.
They became the rock band that the mainstream liked. Everybody loved Motörhead, they were in the charts, and everyone said, great, what a fine bunch of British eccentrics. And the way they were eccentric, they were seen as characters. They were as threatening as the Carry On movie characters. They didn't seem threatening, even though they looked threatening. And let's face it, you look at the cover of Ace of Spades, these three guys with ponchos looking like they've stepped out of spaghetti western, except it looks like a sandpit in your local school in New Malden, rather than out there in the desert. Somehow all that came together and made Motörhead a band that the mainstream felt weren't really threatening.
They had a thing, Motörhead, that they only ever had producers for 2 albums. I think they wore them out. And dear old Jimmy Miller bowed out. Vic Mail came in. He'd been working with bands like Dr. Feelgood, who were sort of the predecessors of punk, and he knew how to get a good sound down. It was a little bit cleaner, less in your face perhaps, but still with the guts. And he took them away to his studio in Rickmansworth. He got a very good album out of them, and I think certainly as far as Lemmy's songwriting goes, it's never been better than that.
I think they knew they were onto a massive album when they did that, and you can just hear it in the playing, and Vic Mail managed to capture all that.
There isn't a bad song on there. You know, here is a band who at the time were creating the most abrasive and extreme rock and roll stroke heavy metal that there was. Okay, and yet they never lost sight of a good song. Every song on that record is a bloody good, catchy song.
The only thing you see, you know it's gonna be the ace of spades, the ace of spades.
Lemmy's Motörhead, and Motörhead is Lemmy. He's said it himself many occasions, and he's absolutely right.
How long have I been on the road?
Yeah.
19 years.
19 years.
Yeah, give or take a year.
I mean, isn't it boring after a while?
No.
Yes, without Lemmy there could be no Motörhead, and it's probably true that without Motörhead Lemmy might not be around either.
I mean, why do you do such a heavy group? Can't you play it a little softer?
Yeah, could do. Could do, but I'm not going to.
Lemmy defines Motörhead, always has done, always will do.
We like it. We don't like little softies.
But don't you think there is a point after which there is no comeback, no return? It's a one-way to hell, maybe.
Right.
So what you gonna do?
Go to hell. See you there.
Lemmy has always had the focus, the vision, the forward thinking. He's always been the leader of the band, even back in the early days. He put the band together. It was his idea. He knew what he wanted.
Does it all come from the PA or from the energy of the musicians?
Both.
The energy of the musicians.
Through the PA.
Where did you find Phil?
I found him. I found him in the corner of my room, lying down, actually. Didn't I, Phil?
Why did they call you the animal, Phil?
Well, they didn't. It was
Because he likes to scroll stations.
a young lady I used to know called me Filthy Animal.
A genius. I think Lemmy is one of the all-time greats. I have no compunction about saying that. And every photo shoot we ever did with them was totally over the top, and always worked, and we had great fun doing it. Well, at that time, I would try any idea. We just came up with ideas out of the blue, and let's try that, you know. And we got a Roman candle, and we taped it to the back of the guitar, and lit it. And we shot it, lit the candle, smoke and flames coming out everywhere, and he did all these poses. And when it was over, he said, "You know, did you ever do that before then?" You know, I said, "No." He said, "If that blew up, it would have blown my bloody leg off."
The musicality with Lemmy is often overlooked. People talk about the personality of Lemmy. People talk about his TV appearances and the Kit Kat ad, for instance, and his film appearances. People talk about the warts and the moustache and so forth. People rarely talk about Lemmy the musician. I don't believe you can have as long a career as Lemmy with as much success and respect as Lemmy without having a lot of musical talent.
The interesting thing about Motörhead is you stick your fingers in your ears when they're playing, and you listen to what Lemmy's playing, and there's some extraordinary stuff going on there, all sorts of chords and harmonics that are flying around. So it isn't just to kind of crank it up and play a lot of noise. There's a bit of a method behind the whole thing.
There's a level of intensity required to play live the sort of music that Motörhead play. If Lemmy wasn't a good bass player, he wouldn't be able to do that.
I think if you're in a three-piece band, you have to do more than just plonk the root notes, and nobody would ever say that Lemmy only plonks. He attacks it, doesn't he? And I think he uses a Rickenbacker bass, which has got a lot more highs than, say, something like a Precision. So, in a way, the guitarist has to lay down the foundation, and Lemmy sort of speeds along over the top. It's a reversal of roles to some bands. It's almost like a lead bass, but nobody can say it's not right for the sound.
Shut up, you talk too loud. You don't fit in with the crowd. I can't believe you exist. I crossed you right on my list. Too much, too soon. You lay out of tune. No class. No class.
Well, No Sleep Till Hammersmith kind of surprised everybody because, on hindsight, it is now racked up side by side with Live at Leeds, which absolutely thrills Lemmy to death because Live at Leeds is one of his favourite albums as much as it's one of my favourite albums. And I think it was just the time was right.
To record a live album when you're in your moment, as Motörhead were with Ace of Spades, then it stands to reason that what you're going to get with the live album, No Sleep Till Hammersmith, hopefully is going to be something of the same level. And this is Motörhead at their peak, the peak of their creativity, you know, the peak of their playing, the peak of their performance, the peak of their success. So they record a live album, and it's one of the greatest live albums of all time.
What made No Sleep work was the fact that it was so exciting. It captured the energy and the imagination, and it captured the aggression, the personality, the character of Motörhead and the audience on those nights.
I don't think it's a fantastic live album in the sense it's any better than any other live album, but it obviously represented what the public saw in Motörhead. And it went to #1. We only ever had one #1 album in the whole of Bronze Records' career, and that was it, so it says something.
No Sleep Till Hammersmith is probably their best album in terms of capturing the essence of Motörhead and presenting their sound at full throttle on a record. I mean, it's Ace of Spades is great, but this was Motörhead live. That's where they're in their element.
I think the success of No Sleep Till Hammersmith really proves that Motörhead are a quintessential stage band, and that's what people perceive them as. Certainly these days you'll still get sell-out Motörhead tours, but the albums don't make the numbers that perhaps they used to.
The great rock bands, the great rock and roll bands, always come alive on stage. That's where they're in their element, facing a crowd, aggression, energy backwards and forwards, that's where they really live. And while Motörhead, I'm sure, accepted that they had to go into a studio to record, it was on stage where they really came into their own, where they were louder than anybody else, more aggressive than anybody else, and where the crowd went absolutely mental and crazy. That's really learnt the Motörhead experience, not from listening to their albums. Their albums were an introduction, but if you really wanted to learn the lesson, you went and saw Motörhead live.
I think really if you had a silhouette from Lemmy from all the years of Motörhead, it's pretty much the same. The right foot is usually on one of the legs of the mic stand. You know, the microphone is cocked because he likes to get his voice out and up into it, and the playing stance and everything. It's just Lemmy. Nobody can ever sort of mimic him.
The thing that had made Motörhead so interesting up until that point was that they appeared to be very instinctual. They didn't appear to spend too long thinking about things, too long pontificating about them. It was very visceral, very from the gut. If it felt right, it is right, let's do it. Conversely, Iron Fist was made in a dreadful hurry. Suddenly, the need is there to make a follow-up, another hit. And although they tried very, very hard not to fall into that trap, inevitably It's exactly what happened, and I don't think any of the 3 original members that made the album will tell you anything particularly good about the experience.
They started doing it in Rickmansworth Jackson Studios again. I went out there a couple of times and it just wasn't... Lemmy was in the pub, basically. There were 2 working titles for the songs, and one was Lemmy Goes to the Pub, and another song was called Lemmy Comes Back from the Pub, and it sounded like that's where I saw him, in the pub, when I got off the train. It wasn't working out with Vic Mail.
The problem with Iron Fist isn't necessarily the songs, the problem is the production. They decided, well, let's produce ourselves. Fast Eddie Clarke wants to be a producer, he's worked with 1 or 2 bands, well, let him produce it. Didn't work.
Motörhead had been on the road. They'd had 2 very successful albums, they'd been promoting them, they'd been touring the States for months, and again, they were writing songs on the spot in the studio, and they weren't that. Heart of Stone is a brilliant song. I love that one. And the title song is pretty good, Iron Fist, but there were a few duffers. It was back to a couple of classics and a bit of filler.
Yes, it's not creatively as good as Ace of Spades. The title track, I think, is a great song. But by that point, the age-old personnel problems had started to creep, and it was the last album that Fast Eddie was going to record with the band. Anyone who's ever met Lemmy will tell you he's a lovely bloke, but he's a cantankerous old git as well, and he'll probably agree with that himself. You know, not easy people to get on with, a lot of drugs going on. You know, they're never going to deny that. So and that affects everything from, you know, inter-band relationships to the quality of material.
I think what summed it up is they were going to do a great introduction to their stage set. What they were going to have was a screen that came down in front of the stage showing footage of Motörhead all dressed up, the 3 of them, in medieval garb, carrying swords and so forth, wandering around, looking menacing. And then the 3 of them were going to jump through the screen and start the show. Great idea, never came off and never worked and was never used. Part of the reason was I actually saw the footage that they shot as the intro. It looked like 3 idiots, completely pissed, just wandering around in a forest. It was completely ridiculous. It just did not work. And I think that's the trouble with Iron Fist. Interesting ideas, but they don't actually work. There's no cohesion to the record.
Why Eddie left was the single that Lemmy recorded with Wendy O. Williams of Plasmatics, which was a cover version of the country standard Stand By Your Man, Tammy Wynette song. Eddie really wasn't too keen on this at all, and when Wendy had problems getting into tune, Lemmy was prepared to put up with it, but Eddie wasn't. So off the job he went, out of the band he went. Apparently he'd been inclined to leave every few months anyway at that stage, if Lemmy's to be believed. Just this time he wasn't asked back.
I went round Eddie's flat like after he'd left, and he had big plans to do his own group, because one thing about Iron Fist, he'd made sure he had his own track on there, which I think it was called Step Down, which he sings on. And there was an element that he thought he should be a bit more prominent, so he went off on his own. Which, to quote a Motörhead song, was Kiss of Death.
I think really that particular lineup, they struggled sort of through so much crap, you know, as being called the worst band in the world and getting knocked back so many times, and I think the fans were sort of rooting for all 3 of them so much. And when it came to a point when Fast Eddie left, I think a lot of them just kind of sort of thought, oh, that's it, that's the end.
Motörhead had over 7 or 8 years more or less created their own template. They weren't like any other band, and so to replace any of the members was always going to be difficult. Phil Taylor, the drummer, was a very keen Thin Lizzy fan, and I think it may well have been he who put Brian Robertson's name up in the frame. Obviously Lemmy was very aware of what Robbo had done. They brought him in. He was technically a better player than Fast Eddie Clarke, but as we found, he really wasn't as compatible perhaps as the guy whose place he took and those who followed him.
The time I spent with him, and the time I spent with him during the album, Filthy Animal, just my best friend. He was just so cool. And Lemmy, you know, people think he's Mr. Hardman and all this. He's not. He's just big softy. He's useless. He's a big softy, right? And so you had to sort of like pull together on it, and I enjoyed every single second of it, and I honestly wouldn't put any of it behind me with any sort of, ooh, didn't like that. I did. My input was pretty large, actually, because basically Motörhead had been a band that they would go in with a producer and they'd do as the producer told them. So they go in there all together in the same studio and go bam bam bam, and just do basically a live thing, right? I didn't really do that. I took the Lizzy thing into the Motörhead thing. So, and funnily enough, we had our producer, my old producer, from Thin Lizzy, was producing it. So it was kind of me and him worked together, right?
I guess what I was trying to do was to find out how far we could push it in which directions, and inevitably I'd already started to realise that there were going to be, you know, some factions pushing backwards and forwards. Robbo, a very strong-minded guy, you know, he had his idea of where it could go, and potentially maybe a little more open-minded musically than everybody else. Lemmy, you know, it's his band, so he was always going to want to exert a certain amount of authority in that respect. I think one of the most extraordinary things I found out was what an amazing drummer Phil is. I mean, that was, you know, I didn't realise that until the point that we started working on things, and Robbo started throwing in much more complex stuff into the mix, and Phil was able to respond to that, you know, very, very easily.
He's like a demolition course, you know. It's like he doesn't play from the wrists, he doesn't play from there, he plays from the shoulder, and he hits the bloody things that he wants to kill somebody.
The most defined difference in that album was that Robbo as a guitar player was surprisingly much more ready to listen to what Lemmy was doing and to try and interpret that and to add to it with the guitar, rather than just play this kind of riff over the top. I mean, I'm not a great, I think Ace of Spades is a great track, but quite honestly, most of the stuff that they'd done before was just an accident.
We'd done all the backing tracks, me and Tony Platt, who obviously did AC/DC Back in Black and also the first Thin Lizzy album I ever worked on, right? So we were pretty close. And he walks in, he goes, this is bollocks, I'm going to the pub. Fuck off to the pub, and okay, so you don't see him for a while. You don't see Filthy for a while, because Filthy doesn't want to be there unless something's happening, right? So I just went, oh, well, look, you know, I'm just kind of cheesed off with this. We're trying to write an album here, and there isn't anybody here except me, so I'm a bit pissed off. So what I did was I mic'd the drums up, stuck them through the mixing desk, and then brought them back through the PA on a cassette. So I just sit there and play a load of drums, and then play it back through the PA, and then write the guitar riffs while Lemmy was in the pub. And then he'd come back and go, yeah, that's cool, right. And then he'd go off, and then when we got to the eventual studio, he'd disappear for half an hour and come back with these amazing lyrics that you just go, what's he talking about? He's off his tits.
Lemmy has never, in my opinion, been given credit for his lyrics, which actually are very meaningful and are not just ordinary puerile lyrics, or what most people write any old word to any old note. Lemmy wrote about things that he believed in.
You know, Lemmy's lyric writing is absolutely fantastic. I mean, there are lines in those songs that are just immortal. I mean, they're fantastic. The Funny Farm, I mean, that's, you know, I really like that jacket, but the sleeves are much too long. Who else but Lemmy could come up with lyrics like that?
And it took me a couple of minutes to figure out what the hell he was talking about. Then I realized he was talking about a straitjacket, and he was talking about where you put people when they're completely mental, which is basically where we should have been, right? And I just cracked up laughing. And so every time Tony Platt said to me, solo, because I did a guitar solo on it, right? I couldn't, but I had to take his vocal off in my headphones because I just kept laughing. Because every time he said that, I just thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard.
When Another Perfect Day came out, I reviewed it for Kerrang! Magazine at the time. I didn't like it. In fact, I remember saying I thought this was possibly another nail in Motörhead's coffin, which Lemmy didn't take kindly to, I have to say, and I can understand why. Subsequently, and years later, I have to say I've really come to love that album. I've come to understand and appreciate why it worked. At the time, I thought this was Lemmy and Filthy being Motörhead and Brian Robertson, ex-Thin Lizzy, coming in and just wailing over the top, and there's no cohesion between the two. I was completely off beam because there's absolute cohesion and continuity between the two.
Another Perfect Day is a fantastic album. Robbo's playing, on paper, you wouldn't figure him for someone who could replace Fast Eddie. Much more proficient, much more technically adept player than Eddie, but is he Motörhead? If you listen to a track like Shine, for me, he's totally Motörhead. It's a fantastic song. I never realised Motörhead could go to that place that a track like Shine does. I never realised that they could have a guitarist as good as Robbo and really make it work and still sound like Motörhead, but they did and they do.
I was proud of it. I was proud of it. I enjoyed recording it and I was proud of it, you know.
Everybody was really happy with it. And nobody was more surprised than I was when Lemmy suddenly started saying how he hated this and he didn't like that, and you know, all that I apparently had just ruined everything. I I don't know. I've not ever been able to have a proper conversation with him, which is a bit of a pity, really. But no, he loved it. He really did like the album when we finished. I think he was actually quite proud of the album after we'd finished. You know, I was very surprised that somebody of his strength of character capitulated so easily to the whinging of a few of the fans.
We didn't. He had this impression that we hated it for whatever reason, but we didn't. I mean, the only kind of daft track was Die You Bastard. Everything else was an absolute diamond.
Another Perfect Day just wasn't Motörhead for me. You know, the producer tried to move it in a different direction. Bad mistake. Robbie was not Eddie as far as being a guitarist is concerned. It just wasn't as good.
Right now, right here, ain't gonna let you disappear. Right now, this time, you got yours and I got mine.
Whether he was the right guy to join Motörhead, well, I think hindsight proves that no, he wasn't. Another Perfect Day is actually quite a good record, I think, but I think the problem was that obviously when Robbo appeared with Motörhead, he didn't want to be in the band anymore.
He went very much against the grain. He cut his long hair short. He wore pink shorts on stage. He did everything he could to underline the fact that this was Motörhead with Robbo, as opposed to this is just Motörhead as a gang.
Somebody should have got Robbo a bit more under control, that's for sure, because he's the sort of guy that needs, you know, somebody to take him by the scruff of the neck every now and then. But there was a lot more music to be made, a hell of a lot more music to be made. It was kind of a bit cowardly, I guess, to sort of, you know, just dump it all.
I don't know. I think Lemmy wanted to go back to where he was, and you know, and just batter out what he wanted to batter out, which is fair enough. And 10 points to the band, right? I mean, the guy's a legend, and he's, you know, I knew him years before I even joined the band. You know, so it's not. There's no bone of contention there.
When you sign a record deal, you don't look in the small print and see whether it says we can have a greatest hits collection at this point or that point or whenever we feel like it. I don't think Lemmy really had a lot of choice in the fact it was going to happen. But what he said was, well, hang on a minute, you're not nailing the lid on my coffin yet. We've got plenty more to come. We may have taken a duff step. It may not have gone well with Robbo, but we can certainly produce more of the goods.
So what they decided to do was introduce the new lineup while also reminding people about their great moments. So they did 4 new tracks: Locomotive, Snaggletooth, Steal Your Face and Killed by Death, which all went on the Greatest Hits record.
Lemmy basically had to assemble a new band, and he got in Pete Gill, the old Saxon drummer, who literally only lasted, I think, for the period of the new material they recorded for this record. An ex-army bloke called Wurzel, who's a lovely chap, and Phil Campbell, who'd played in a terrible heavy metal band called Persian Risk.
And the very first track they released with this new lineup was Killed by Death, which is got to be one of the greatest titles of a rock track ever. And it's Motörhead, and we are not only back, but we are badder than ever.
Killed by Death, that's the one. Because Killed by Death's one of the best songs that Motörhead ever did.
It's a great Motörhead song. And it sounds brilliant. It's very heavy, you know, and musically it's great.
It's funny, had a hilarious video to go along with it, and it was a marvellous record. It's a great song. It still stands up today. And whenever now people say great Motörhead songs, that's going to be in the top 5 or 6.
Taylor, he's a pain in the arse that never stops moving around. Lemmy is Lemmy. He is an intelligent, scruffy, scuzzbaggish, artistic genius. Woozle drinks a lot of beer and falls over a lot and likes four-legged animals. And I am not sure what I am. One day I hope to find out.
We had a couple of nutters back in the band who looked the part, and they were great. I mean, they were two eager young kids who hadn't experienced the rock star lifestyle, so they had no. Obviously, they loved it when it came, but they didn't have any sort of pretensions or aspirations like that. They just loved being in Motörhead, and that shows.
Well, I don't take downers, but we do uppers quite often. Uppers and downers. What do you mean, in the career? Well, it's like with any band, I think. It's bound to be up and down, isn't it? Especially at night in a hotel room. It's up and down a lot of the time.
I don't think in terms of music it really made a lot of difference to Motörhead. I think they are and always will be really a three-piece band, but at the time Lemmy felt that, you know, there was strength in numbers.
Two guitarists, each playing exactly the same notes all the way from top to bottom. And I used to say, well, why have two people playing the same note? There was no attempt to expand any sort of talent, and what they played wasn't all that great. You know, you had one guy, Eddie, who played fantastic licks, and they would try to replace him with two guys who could play guitar. And in fact, it's a tour de force, because to be able to play exactly the same thing as somebody else non-stop is very difficult to do. Well, they managed to do that. It was very unimpressive.
I think personally, Orgasmatron, which was the first proper album made with the four-piece lineup, is one of the best albums Motörhead ever did.
Orgasmatron was Motörhead making a very, very serious attempt at making a pretty serious album. Lots of fun on the album, particularly in the title track, which is amazing. But it was their first album after the Robbo era, and while Another Perfect Day had gone down like a cup of cold sick with traditional Motörhead fans, even though people like me thought it was pretty good, this was very much a return to their roots.
Orgasmatron is typical, I think, of almost every Motörhead album that's followed Ace of Spades. They've all been good records, and they all have moments of brilliance. And you know, for Orgasmatron, it's the title track. It just blows you away. That's a great song.
It was brought to life on stage with a green light on him, and he was doing all this twitching and all this. It's really sort of got into character, and it was an absolute showstopper.
It's an exciting album, and it's a different record. And all you have to do is listen to the title track, which is a slightly more experimental song. And you know that Motörhead were trying different things here. It was as if having the extra guitarist in the band, in fact, having a new lineup, Lemmy being the only one who remained from the previous incarnation, the classic incarnation, had given him a severe kick up the arse.
But they were pretty disappointed with it because they were happy with it as it was. And Bill Laswell, the producer, took it to the power station in America to remix it. And when it came back, apparently the band were sitting down thinking, is this the same album? You know, they were writing down all these things that were wrong with it. Saying, you know, this isn't the album that it started out being. And they didn't have the budget left to sort of give it back to Bill Laswell and say, well, can you put everything back to how it was before? Because we liked it as it was before you took it to America and mixed it, you know. So
this was at a time when speed metal was coming in from America, and Motörhead were the granddaddies, so I guess they had to show how it was done, which they did on Orgasmatron. I thought that was, you know, the Hellbound Train on the cover says it all, really.
With Orgasmatron, it's a good record, but so is We Are Motörhead, so was 1916, you know, albums that followed sort of down the line, and they all suffered the sort of similar fate. Yeah, well, it's not Ace of Spades, is it? I mean, and Orgasmatron is a perfect example of that. I mean, it's certainly better than Another Perfect Day and Iron Fist, a lot better. But people, by that point, were viewing Motörhead as in a different way, and in a way which they've continued to ever since. And it's just an awful situation that Motörhead have never managed to extricate themselves from.
Whatever you call Motörhead, whether it's rock and roll, heavy metal, punk metal, grindcore, you know, whatever weird name you come up for it, essentially it's Motörhead. There really isn't any other band in the world that is remotely like them.
Well, I'm just really glad they're still going, because Lemmy has now become a national treasure, part of the furniture, part of the, you know, he's always been there. He's playing. Lemmy doesn't have to change. He can always be the same, because there'll be new generations coming up. He'll still be doing it when he's 80, so there'll be another generation for him to be Lemmy.
I think people have always considered Lemmy to be ageless. He's almost an elder brother or an uncle to people. I don't think that the passage of time has had any effect, certainly any audible effect, on how he plays or sings. So I think the aspect of age for Motörhead is really irrelevant. I think people will come and watch them no matter what their age, because Lars Ulrich of Metallica has said they're cool, because some current band has name-checked them. I think they will always be around, and they'll always be as hip as they ever were, probably because they've never been hip.
Why is there so much violence on the road? Why do you break things in hotel rooms? I mean, the violence. I mean, when you start doing things.
Fucking violence!
I don't know what you mean about violence, huh? If you want to see some violence, baby, come and see me.
They've had their ups and downs, they've gone through troughs, they've gone through real problems financially, business-wise, musically, but they've always come out on top because Lemmy has refused to let it die. And Lemmy, as long as Lemmy keeps fighting the good fight, as it were, Motörhead will carry on fighting.
Look what they're doing! It's animals! Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this, Lemmy?
Why not?
I mean, you shouldn't be doing this.
Oh, sorry, we shouldn't be doing this. Oh, well, it's all part of the...
Don't break it on me, don't break it on me.
How's that? What do? Is that enough?
What's the title of the next record? What's
We Are Not Violent.
You know, for me, they simply sit in that classic, all-time great, totally unique spot that only and only they occupy.
No! Not me!
How old have you come?
What record?
What record?
Your next record.
What are you talking about?
Your next record.
You want to do an interview?
Yeah,
What's it like being killed by Motörhead?